All right, I think I should be live now. Let me just check. Yep. All right, so tonight is a very special Halloween edition of Paint Time with Peter. I got these dollar store skeletons, and I figured I'm going to try to paint these, see how well they turn out if I actually paint these like a regular mini. Now, I did my best to remove mold lines, because dear God, did these things have mold lines, but it was nearly impossible to completely remove the mold lines from these things. They're basically this very soft plastic, softer than I was used to. And I started to cut into the actual, body of the skeletons in the process of removing the mold lines. It was sort of difficult and messy. So they're not perfect, but I don't care. They're dollar store things. I primed them with airbrush primer, and it was too humid, too wet and humid to use regular rattle can primer, and I don't particularly like using the airbrush primer because it clogs my airbrush. Speaking of which, that's the first thing I'm going to do for this, is I am going to start airbrushing these things, which of course, preferably, I have some like rattle can white paint. I would have preferred to, do white or gray or something other than black, but that was the only airbrush primer that I have. Because that's the only airbrush primer that I have, I'm putting some of this flow improver and thinner in here, because this is just a regular paint. It's not specifically airbrush paint. But anyway, I wasn't able to, because of the weather, I wasn't able to prime these the colors that I want. So I'm going to use this Ashanti bone as a base coat. And I'm not going to go overboard with these. I'm just going to speed paint them. But I'm curious to see how they'll turn out. Because like I said, these are just dollar store skeletons. And I put some bases on them, some 40mm bases on them. I'm probably going to need a lot of this. So I should probably just like start glooping this in here. I'm probably going to need more airbrush thinner. And apologies in advance for this. Been here whence 20? What? I'm no comprende. Anyway. That's probably enough to get started. I probably have to go back and refill. And I'm going to use more thinner. This is not an ideal setup, but it's as good as I can get in terms of where my monitor is in relation to everything else. So I'm going to have to... Yeah, see, I need a new compressor. I need to invest in a compressor that's doesn't have to kick on every 5 seconds. Because this... I just got like the, standard compressor. The one was like $70, $80. And it doesn't have a very large air tank. It just kicks on constantly. So, some people say that you shouldn't do this backflow method with an airbrush, but I don't really care. I should probably also be wearing like a glove and a mask. I have a mask somewhere, but I don't think there's too much. I might have to use my other... no, just barely. That's going on pretty good. Yeah, pretty much the key to speed painting something, a bunch of these things, is to have something like an airbrush. I think I'll probably blast all of these and then, you know, airbrush most of these and then dry brush all of them. Airbrush all of them, dry brush all of them, and then I'll start focusing on, you know, one or two, trying to bring out more detail and see how it goes from there. But aside from painting, you know, I can't see right now if there's anybody in the chat, how many viewers this has. I'm going to have to switch here in a second, see if I can see how many viewers I have right now, because I'm definitely fine with shooting the shit, as it were, talking about whatever. I should probably get this out of the splatter range of the... You know what, I probably have the pressure up too high on here. But it's working well enough. In fact, it's probably better to have the pressure higher rather than lower. Let me see if I can go to YouTube. And, okay, one person watching. And there's a slight delay. Okay. Mute that. Okay. Have I heard of Ken Wilber, integrated integral theory, metamodernism, and spiral dynamics? I've heard of Ken Wilber. The rest of it, not so much. Is it very new age? It sounds very new age. And could you sort of say, as concisely as you can, sort of what is interesting about those things? Let's see. This isn't taking as much as I thought. I thought because I primed these in black that I'd have to put lots of layers on, but that's the advantage of an airbrush. You blast out something like this relatively quickly. I might have to go back and do other layers. But Ken Wilber, I think I read a couple of his books like 15 years ago. You know, around the time, but a little bit before when I started YouTube. I was more interested in that sort of thing. But I'm not as curious about new age ideas as I was when I was in that phase of my life in my early 20s. Because I realized that a lot of it's just kind of like platitudes and double talk and, you know, debunked quantum woo-woo. So, and again, apologies if the compressor is really loud on this thing. I'll try and get through this part relatively quickly. The pressure's up pretty high, so I think that was mostly because I was priming these last, and last thing I was doing with my airbrush was priming these things. And another thing that I don't like about the primer is that it clogs the airbrush, or it tends to. And it looks like I need to refill this thing. So, yeah, I'm not sure what kind of viewers I'm going to pull tonight, honestly, because it's Halloween, and I'm sure a lot of people have better things to do than watch me paint and shoot the shit. But I don't know. Somebody's got to be out there. Somewhere. Okay. Is this... Okay, this thinner. I need to buy, like, a big bottle of thinner. I just recently bought another bottle of cleaner. Thinner. A couple drops of flow improver. Somewhere. Or let me try to reach for them. Do you ever think civilization is hitting an unsustainable peak if we don't get off this rock and the whole space stream is just an excuse to run away from Earth's problems? Well, let me say with the first thing that comes to my mind first is that I'm not sure how, like how realistic it is, the ideas of, say, terraforming Mars. And there's a part of me that suspects that people like Elon Musk want to go down in history as being the first human on Mars. I think that's his dream, because that will basically make him immortal, at least in terms of fame. You know, Elon Musk, first human on Mars. And then if he privately finances it, then, you know, that will become his, the whole mythology of it. I think that, with some of the space stuff going on right now, it's like billionaires' egos. In terms of the unsustainability of this planet, I think it depends on how long of a time horizon we're talking about. So at some point, it may become necessary to mine asteroids for their resources. But I don't think it's less a matter of resources being unsustainable as humans being stupid. That's probably an overly simplistic way of saying it. But I think if you look at our civilization, that we use a lot of resources, but not in a particularly productive or rational manner. It's very ad hoc, based on markets, which are in a lot of ways Rube Goldberg machines to keep people busy. I mean, I'm really, really oversimplifying here, but I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm spraying, I'm airbrushing these cheap plastic toys. And you got to wonder, like, how much resources went into this? These are made, these are plastics to be a kind of petroleum product. And they make who knows how many of these a year. And at a certain point, you have to wonder, like, why do we need this? Like, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot in the pandemic is, and even before the pandemic, is how much of what people do in the 21st century is busy work. Because in terms of, producing what's genuinely necessary for human survival, I think that we need far fewer, I think it's a fact, that we need far fewer people than there are. And say when you look at the Middle Ages, right, most people were involved with agriculture, and then on top of that you had like narrowing support structures, but it was more or less a pyramid style social arrangement where the higher you went up the social pyramid, the fewer people there were, and to the point where you reach the top where you just have more arguably parasitical people. And there are still parasitical people, but the bottom has gotten a lot smaller in terms of producing essential goods. I think that, I don't remember the exact statistic off the top of my head, but the percentage of people involved with agriculture and other like direct necessity sorts of occupations has shrunk to pretty small because of modern technology. And a lot of people just end up you know, doing what amounts in the grand scheme of things to busy work because of our our social system and our concepts about markets rather than meeting actual human need. In fact, a lot of the inefficiency and craziness and irrationality of a system of, you know, everyone has to work to survive even though most people aren't needed to provide what's necessary for survival, it creates a lot of completely irrational outcomes. And I know I'm not really going into detail or fully articulating what I'm thinking because I have half my mind on what I'm saying and half my mind trying to airbrush these cheap plastic toys that were a waste of natural resources to create to begin with. But I don't think, I mean, like, our way of life is unsustainable for sure, but it's less because, you know, it's less directly because there's, you know, like the raw numbers of how many people are on the planet and, you know, the rate at which we use resources, just more of like, you know, our socioeconomic system that causes us to use more than we really need. But I don't want to get too preachy on that because I, on a personal level, waste plenty of resources in my own life, so I'm not. This one here reminds me. Some of you have probably seen that episode of The Simpsons where they go to dig up a fossil, and they find an angel fossil, and it was all like a scam by the archaeologist. I got some. Aside from these, I also bought, because these were like $1 for an 8-pack. I bought mummies, but after taking the time to remove the mold lines and other crap from this, I was like, nah, I think I'm done with. All right. I think this seems like it's almost out. I gotta clean this. Yeah, this is pretty much out. And rather than do another layer, I'm gonna call it a day with the airbrush. That's one of the problems with the airbrush, though, is it's kind of a pain in the ass to clean. But I'm glad I got this new setup. A couple months ago, I bought a new tripod, and it's able to do like the 90-degree angle thing with the top part of it, and so I'm able to put this camera directly over like this. It's a bit cramped. I find that when I'm doing these, the way that I would normally paint, there's no good way to film it, because I'll have it up real close if I'm going in for detail, or I'll be holding things that if I were to try and put it in the camera and frame that way, that it would just end up like giving people a crotch shot. And so this is sort of a compromise, but at times I have to make a conscious effort to put what I'm doing into frame. And this camera here probably needs to be angled up more. I tried to set all of this up in advance. Okay. Normally I would go through a rather lengthy cleaning process of this airbrush, but I'm just going to try and get the paint out of this for right now, or most of the paint. I love the airbrush, but it can be a bit of a chore to deal with, honestly. Yeah, the episode with the shopping mall. I said sorry if this is a heavy topic, or as heavy as fuck topic, but I know you're a smart dude, so you have good answers. Well, the, honestly, this is one of those subjects that I do like to talk about. I realize that, as I think through these things in my head, it, I think lots of different thoughts. I have lots of different background information pulling from lots of things. And then when I go to articulate it in a moment like this, I'm like, derp a derp a derp, humans waste stuff. Like, yeah, that's, it takes a lot of mental, it just takes a lot of mental energy to, and not only mental energy, but advanced preparation and maybe even scripting to say things that, that go beyond merely just being, saying the, the sort of trite stuff. But I kind of wondered, going back to the situation about people getting off planet and that sort of stuff. I wonder that if you sort of look at things in a very, very long time horizon, if we'll have to resort to geoengineering at some level in order to bring climate change under control, which I believe, either climate change is going to be a complete catastrophe that's going to send us back into something akin to a new dark age, or we will, like, if we overcome it, it will require a lot of, not only scientific breakthroughs, but things like geoengineering. And if that might inadvertently set the stage for things like terraforming, that if we learn to tackle, these major like a major hurdle like climate change might cause us to develop new things that will lead to things like more space exploration, terraforming of other planets. Because World War II obviously was one of the most terrible events in human history, probably the most terrible and significant event in human history, but a lot came out of World War II in terms of technology and advancement of all kinds of things. I don't think I should insult the audience too much by enumerating all of them, but suffice to say, we would not have the world as we know it today without World War II. And wars and crisis generally have a way of accelerating things that, might have taken decades longer or never been explored otherwise. I think I'm just going to leave some of this airbrush cleaner in here and set this aside. Okay. Is that... Put that away. Okay. Are these... How dry are these? See, I feel like I should probably give these another couple minutes to dry, or at least some of them. Because I used a fairly high PSI, and some of them just got soaked. But, yeah, honestly, so far, I primed them, and then I airbrushed them, and now they kind of look like they looked before. This is, hold on, let me see if I can, I think over here there's, what's it called? The mummies that I bought as well, and I think they're sort of the same, they were the same color in terms of the base plastic. Four viewers. That's not bad for Halloween. So yeah, this is how they started out before I primed them. And this is after airbrushing. So yeah, I mean, that's technically a different color, but I just felt like I had this realization, like, oh, I've kind of gone in a circle now. But I think my next step is going to be use this, what is this, long beard gray, and do a dry brush. Hang on one second. I need more paper. I need more paper towels in order to use the dry brush correctly. All right. New paper towel. So it'd be interesting to see because they're not brittle, but it's very bendy plastic, especially compared to working with something like, actual GW models or resin, which is mostly what I'm used to working with. And these are very bendy. And yeah, you can see it's just, so that might might have to basically support them. I'm still not 100. It's still, the airbrush layer is still a bit tacky. And this is not, it's not quite pulling out as much contrast as I thought it would. Let's see. I might do. I might shade them first. So right now I'm basically just going through typical steps of there's sort of a multi-step technique in terms of painting crap like this, where you do base and then shade and then highlights and or dry brushing. Oh man, I think I peeled off some of the... Yeah, I might have to put on a glove to work with these, honestly. So this is a contrast paint called Skeleton Horde, which, I mean, need I say more? It's a paint called Skeleton Horde. I don't think I have to explain why I'm using this. I've used it for a lot of different things. It works pretty well depending on what style of bone you want. I find that there's lots of variation in how it can look. Some people might go for just like a very bleached skeletal look. This has more sepia, brownish sepia. And because these are dollar store things, I'm not really going for detail. Dollar store plus wash does not mean massive attention to detail. But I just wanted to see basically if these would be good enough to use for like D&D or something like that. Maybe I should do like a charity paint thing sometime. Any new comments? No new comments yet. Yeah, honestly, I wasn't sure exactly what kind of chat I'd get tonight, given that it's Halloween and a lot of people are probably out doing fun shit. I should probably try and keep these in some sort of order on the table so that once I go through each of them, like by the time I finish these other ones, the first ones will be done, like, and will be dry enough to work with, but might be rushing a bit too much in terms of letting the paint dry. But it's acrylic paint generally dries pretty fast as long as you don't put too much of it on or put things on that slow the drying, like that flow improver that I was using. It helps, obviously, to keep the brush from getting clogged and for it to go out smoother. It's not quite thinner, but it helps, obviously, as it does what it says on the tin in terms of flow improver, but it's it also slows drying time generally. That's why some of this stuff was still kind of tacky. Let's see. So, yeah, anybody watching this, feel free to jump in the chat, say what you want to talk about, say hello, whatever. I don't have to entirely just ramble on about painting. I think the camera setup's working pretty well, though. Maybe not this part. I might have to tweak the camera aimed at me, but it's hard to tell how well I'm in frame while the monitor's over there, and it's not. I'd have to have something within my eye line or watch the playback of it after, but I'm not too worried about it right now. But let's see. That's probably too much. Still no new comments. Think in a second here, I'm going to check, see if anyone's even watching this crap. I think put this down for a second. So that says 2 people watching. The OBS has a link to the chat, but it does not have actual like viewing figures and stuff like that, which I guess is not that important. I figured I'd just jump on here for fun. It's been a while since I've made a proper video, and it's not for want of things to talk about, but truth be told, I kind of came to the realization that on one hand, there's what I want to talk about, and on the other hand, there's my attitude, which is probably less than productive, because some of you would probably be familiar with the term compassion fatigue. And I guess in the last, well, while now, it's like my, you know, the things that it would be topical to talk about. I'm gonna have to re-super glue that. But the things that it would be topical to talk about, my level of compassion fatigue is kind of at the point of volunteering to go into the hospitals and, you know, pull the plug on some oxygen wasters. You know, when it's time for them to be removed from their ventilators and all that, then, you know, that's a hard thing for doctors and nurses to have to deal with. And, you know, maybe I could go in and do it for them. And obviously I'm exaggerating, but only to a degree. And I don't know how productive it would be to try and talk about those sorts of issues when I'm just like at a point where it's like, well, fuck you, die. That's probably not the world's greatest frame of mind in which to try and engage in any sort of dialogue on a lot of topics. I feel like in the last 5 years, all this sort of like rage at the world that I had when I was younger and started to get over in my later 20s and early 30s, it's like it all came back. It went away for a while, then I realized that sort of darker, negative side of me came back with a vengeance. Just dealing with the way the world is. And it's like I keep mentally circling back around to a lot of the same topics, but it's a matter of finding the approach and finding a way I can talk about them without just venting my rage, although that's sometimes necessary to just be like, you know what, fuck this. But yeah, I think when I was younger, there was a period when I was younger, maybe when I started YouTube, where I was kind of more optimistic, where if only you could talk to people and reason with them, we could change the world by changing people's opinions and, maybe bring more sanity to the world. I'm like, nope, the world is, at least the United States and possibly other countries, is probably 30% possibly irredeemable morons. But then there is another part of me that says, no, it is largely circumstantial. But then I think, yeah, it's circumstantial, but not in a way that I could really affect by talking into a YouTube channel. So people talk about the political divide in America and how we're polarized, but I wonder if you could just wave a magic wand and make your average conservative just chill the fuck out and stop catastrophizing and adopt a live and let live attitude towards life, and maybe take some of their own cherished sources of news and information with an appropriate grain of salt, that it would transform culture overnight. And like much of the culture war and the so-called polarization in the country would just dissipate radically, because there are a lot of people who are just hyped up over things where, imagine if, I don't know, like the old, the cliche joke about somebody smoking some weed or whatever, and then they suddenly get real chill. They're like, oh man, maybe I shouldn't concern myself with gay people and trans people as some sort of existential threat. Maybe I should just let them do their own thing instead of catastrophizing everything and seeing things from this that sort of perspective. Maybe I should just mind my own damn business. Like, imagine that world. Imagine a world where they weren't using their really terrible armchair psychology and sociology to fight a war against people that, in the grand scheme of things, by and large, have no real effect on them. There's these things like, there's all these issues about trans bathroom use and trans kids playing sports. And aside from, of course, I have my own opinions about those things, but just the idea that these genuinely matter to the average person in the way that people are getting upset about them, it just seems utterly ridiculous. Like, I have this theory, basically, that in their worldview, right, that they the right wing, I should say the conservative right wing worldview. I just clarify what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about trans people's worldviews. The conservative right wing worldview. Essentially, they see the world in a very particular way, where it's sort of like, a show where they have, a sort of a villain, like a season-long villain. And season 1 of, say, Stranger Things, they have the Demigorgon, and the next season they have more Demigorgons, and then like the third season they have the Mind Flayer, right? Like, so conservatives, they have a worldview where they have to keep putting things in certain roles in order to justify a worldview in which, the country and the world is in moral decline, that requires a kind of reaction to it in order to save society. Because again, there are all these armchair sociologists who think that these minority groups are in some sense some sort of existential threat to the fabric of society because they think they understand how society works. And so they have to cast certain groups in these roles. And for a while, you had, season whatever of their worldview. They had gay people in the role of the sexual deviant to beat up on. And then society, the general society changed, and they were able, we got gay marriage and a changing in general social attitudes towards gay people and gay marriage, and it left a lot of conservatives who had made this their bread and butter fighting an increasingly rearguard action against that. And they kind of realized they were on the losing side in terms of using, casting gay people in, the role of social deviant in their catastrophized psychodrama of the moral decline of society. But then you have a moment, and I think I'm not sure the exact moment, but if I had to point to it, it'd probably be the "Call Me Caitlyn" moment with Caitlyn Jenner. Now, of course, many different societies have different views of gender and multiple variations on gender. It's not as if trans people have only existed for the last 10 years or anything like that. But suddenly it got, trans issues got a lot more visibility, and it was like it seemed to be like there was this simultaneous moment of realization where they're like, oh, we have a new villain to cast in our role as a the sexual deviant in our psychodrama about the moral decline of society. And so it became this issue that's completely, there's no way to really, I think, explain the fervor and the intensity over which these sorts of debates are happening, in terms of referencing anything actually going on in society. It is completely out of all proportion in terms of its, what's actually happening in the world. But when you understand that it's like, part of a narrative, then you go, okay, I see what's going on here with this being they have a particular story arc that they're going for. And just like they have the Demigorgon in season 1 and the more Demigorgons and the Demidogs in season 2 and then the Mind Flayer in season 3. It's like they keep having to, up the stakes and recast these things to sort of slot things into their pre-existing worldview. And so on one hand, it's like, yeah, I care because I have trans friends, and I generally have a live and let live attitude, and I don't like, if there's one thing that pisses me off, like, being a cisgendered heterosexual white guy, there's not much that can genuinely offend or upset me because I coast through life on a cloud of privilege. But that doesn't mean I can't get pissed off and basically things like cruelty and dangerous stupidity. Like, these things piss me off to the point where I want to speak up and say something. And it seems to a lot of the things, a lot of what I see is like, you know what? If you stopped being cruel and started seeing, like, again, mellowed out, then, let go of a lot of your preconceived notions and your apocalyptic worldview and your armchair sociology, you'd realize that the world is not as bad as you're imagining it to be, at least in terms of, like, the right-wing worldview. It's you look at the rhetoric of it. It's practically from the moment Joe Biden took office. It's like, America, the liberals and the Democrats are going to destroy America. Everything is put in these, catastrophized language. And it's one thing to say, I don't really agree with Democratic policies, and I don't believe that tax hikes are good, or I don't believe in Medicare for all or whatever. I mean, I would still disagree with a lot of those sort of right-wing opinions, but when it's put in such catastrophic terms, it precludes the possibility of having any sort of adult discussion about policy or about political disagreement. And it's all about, we must defeat the liberals and the Democrats because they are an existential threat. And it's like, you know what? Chill the fuck out. If you, like, took a more realistic appraisal of America and society, you would not have such a catastrophized worldview. But anyway, I'm rambling. Hold on. Let me catch up on the chat. Okay, there's basically only one person chatting. Let's see. The game Dead Space. I've never played Dead Space. Okay. Okay. More profit in treatment than a cure. What's the line from Doctor Who? Why sell a single cure when you can sell 1,000 palliatives? I've been rewatching the modern Doctor Who. It's going pretty good. How is your Halloween? Okay, so it depends on what is wrong with the person, though, and lifestyle and other external factors and help that is available. I'm not sure what specifically you're referring to. All right. Sometimes that contrast paint takes a little while to dry. But this first one that I dry brushed, I think I have to be a bit lighter on these things. Getting the I just kind of want the edge detail. Maybe that's not enough. Trying to find a happy medium here. I think I wiped too much off now. That's the dry brushing can be tricky because you have to find the right balance between how much paint you leave on the brush, how heavily you're applying the brush. But this is just like a makeup brush. These things are great for this kind of thing. But this one I think I need to either soak in paint, like brush cleaner long enough to get the stuff out, or just buy another one because they're like $1 a piece. Oh, I think I started to crack some of the... I'm also not entirely sure that the primer's fully cured. I mean, this is all very sloppy, but then again, these are like these are literally dollar store things, but they're appropriate for Halloween at least. Oh, sorry. So when I talked about pulling the plug on people, I was specifically talking about, to be more specific, there are a lot of people who are anti-vaxxed. Just the situation we found ourselves in, where people who refuse to get vaccinated end up being the ones, like 99 point something % of the people in hospitals dying. Not everyone who's unvaccinated, but amongst the people who do end up dying on ventilators from COVID, 99 point something % are unvaccinated. And I don't know if you've heard of the Herman Cain Award, but it's basically it's basically for people who, like they're COVID deniers and then they get COVID. They refuse to get vaccinated and get COVID. And some people on Reddit and other places sort of relish posting things where they're showing all of these social media posts that they had made prior to their death, anti-COVID stuff. And then they would, and then the last post is, pray for this person, or, or their obituary or something like that. And, at a certain point, I kind of realized it's like, well, I'd like to talk about certain current event things, but you know what? This is one of those rare moments in life where people's, people's mentality, they have to actually suffer the consequences. It's like, you know what? Maybe it's just better to let, if people don't get it from like suffering the consequences, then they're never going to get it. But what I was saying in terms of overall video making, it sort of becomes a distraction when you have a terrible, you like having a bad attitude about talking about things like that, talking about relevant things sort of disincentivizes it, because it's like, I don't want to just be that person that turns on the camera, goes on some angry rant. That might feel, gratifying momentarily, but it's the sort of thing I'd look back on in a week, a month, a year, and be like, you know what? Making that video was kind of a mistake. I was in a weird place, and I should not have gone with that. Let's see, yeah. I think I might be going too heavy on this. It's hard to tell, because there's also, I don't know, there's I just need to hit, like, certain raised spots. But yeah, if you said, for saying that sorry that you missed the point, I'm not even sure that I articulated the point well enough for you to need to apologize. I probably just rambled a bunch of stuff. Half my brain is painting and half my brain is trying to make an intellectual point. And those things don't always go together so well. Let's see. All right. I feel like I should have, I don't know, spooky music on or something. There's this music that I made a long time ago, more than 10 years ago now, this album that I made, and I used to play that for, like, trick-or-treaters when I'd hand out candy. And I got a fair amount of compliments on it. It's probably the only time. I also made music for a friend of mine made a zombie game for Android where you use the what's it called, the not GPS, but the, I almost said the gyroscope or whatever, where you have to move your phone in order to avoid the zombies. And I made the music for that. It only ended up being like 2 songs, really. And I made this like fairly long song. It was maybe like 5 minutes long, and I figured, I don't know if this is going to be enough music. And then I, actually played the game. It's like, yeah, you'd be lucky to make it past a minute. And if I had known, like, how quickly and easily you can die in the game, I might have changed around the song. Red Hammer. Yeah, I plan on making more videos soon. I also want to do not paint videos like this. I'll occasionally do these paint videos, but I've been thinking about doing videos where I find some other YouTubers that I like and interview them. And I got to figure out who's available, who's not too popular too popular to hang out with the likes of me. But I have not seen Halloween Kills. Honestly, I'm not really a fan of the Halloween franchise. I remember this was almost 20 years ago now. I think it was 2003. Myself and my girlfriend at the time borrowed the Friday the 13th movies from a mutual friend who had all the Friday the 13th movies, at least the ones that were out as of 2003. And I think I got to the 4th or 5th movie before I was just like, you know what, I'm done with this. So obviously, what's the name of the game that I did the music for? I think it's called Dead Stride. Dead Stride, if I remember correctly. But anyway, I've seen obviously the first Halloween movie, and I think I've seen the second one, or maybe I've just seen reviews of it, and so it's kind of like my brain kind of filled in a lot of it. I really want to see the third one. I must need to sit down and watch the third one sometime, even though it has nothing to do with the main franchise, because it looks kind of cool in its own way. But I don't know. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of horror. That's not to say that I don't like any horror movies, but I'm not one of those people who is just, I don't, yeah. They're not my cup of tea. There are great horror movies, and then there's a lot of blah. I remember when you predicted Trump's election in your 2016 Halloween video. No, I told that as a horror story, and then we all got to live it for 4 years. That reminds me, speaking of making videos, and 4 years of Trump, I got a comment. It's been a couple months now because I'm lazy about this sort of stuff. I got a comment a while ago from somebody on the live stream that I did for Joe Biden's inauguration. I think it was titled something like "The Nightmare is Over," which is obviously a reference to Ford saying our long national nightmare has ended. And they said that they asked if Trump was really that bad, and challenged me to cite actual, policies and things that Trump had done. And for one thing, the person didn't just seem like, one of the people in the cult of Trump that just believe that everything he does is great, and any criticism of him is just, the liberals saying Orange Man bad or fake news. Like, they seem, the way that it was phrased, this person seemed like they had a fairly reasonable, it's not that they were pro or anti-Trump. It was just like they didn't seem like they were coming at it from the blind, the blind Trump follower perspective. But on one hand, I thought, okay, it is true that George W. Bush got us into wars like Iraq. He got a lot of Iraqis killed. I started thinking about all these different things of what exactly, how could you put it in clear, debatable terms what made Trump so bad, and was he really worse than Bush? And I think in the moment, there was a bit of hyperbole to whatever I said, like him being the worst president ever. But I also thought that the comment kind of was doing something not necessarily underhanded, but by framing it specifically in terms of policies, that overlooks quite a lot. There's a lot more to evaluating how good of a president somebody was. So I started thinking about metrics. Like there's the president as an individual. There's the president as an administration. Because in a lot of ways, it's true that the Trump administration was basically when you have a political administration, you hire all these cabinet positions and these secretarial positions, that you're of course going to get just boilerplate Republicanism if you have a Republican president, and boilerplate, Democratism if you have a Democratic president. And so a lot of the actual policy stuff that Trump did is just, on one hand, I personally don't agree with most of it. On the other hand, it's just boilerplate Republicanism. In a certain few cases, you have scumbags like Stephen Miller who, you push things in, and a few other grifters and other people who push things in even more odious and conflict of interest and corrupt way than a typical Republican administration. It was, like an evolution of the usual crap. But generally speaking, I don't agree with Republican policies. But that's also, it's hard to launch from that to say, well, he's the worst, because it's like Bush but worse. That being said, though, I in some ways I kind of agree that in certain respects Trump was not worse than someone like Bush. And obviously, people, Obama had many failings. Clinton had many failings. Like every president has their own failings, but the way that the comment was framed was in very specifically about policy. And I think that there's a lot of different metrics that you can evaluate a presidency. So I almost wanted to go make a video where I say, okay, here's a set of metrics. Like, how can we compare Trump to this president or that president? Here's a different set of metrics. Here's why, here's the things that I genuinely didn't like about it. But I guess if I had to summarize it, in case I never make this video, for those of, the 3 people watching this, if I had to summarize what it was the first time in my life when Trump was president when I genuinely believed that I would be a better president than Trump. Like if through some miracle, divine intervention, whatever, I suddenly had swapped places with Trump, even if it was like a Freaky Friday type thing where I suddenly, like, we swapped brains or something like that, and everybody thought I was Trump, as terrible as that it would be. Even with that, it's like I genuinely believe that I know more about the world, that just like in almost every regard, he may have slightly more managerial experience and delegatory experience, but in almost every regard, I would be a better president. And I don't say that flippantly. And in all honesty, and this is what kind of goes back to the whole issue of people living in a media bubble and dismissing any criticism of Trump as fake news and that sort of thing, but by very credible accounts from people who were in the White House, that he spent approximately 8 hours a day watching cable news. Of course, the guy only slept like 4 or 5 hours a night, but still, he spent like 8 hours a day or more watching cable news. He spent time calling people on the phone. That's, of course, when he just didn't, say fuck it and went to one of his golf courses at the taxpayer's expense. He didn't do much actual work, and most of the bread and like most of what the nuts and bolts of what happened in his administration was kind of like done by delegated off to the people. That's again why often when you talk about the president as a person, or you can talk about the presidency as an administration, and then when you have a Republican administration, it gets filled with all these people that just carry out boilerplate Republican policies. And so a lot of what happened under Trump was just boilerplate Republican policies. And it's just like I could put in an actual day's work. And I know what live wires not to touch in order to send the system crashing down. I'm not saying I'd be a great president. I'd change the world. I'd solve all the world's problems. I'd be way over my head, but also more competent and capable and harder working than Trump. I would have been, and it was, again, it's the first time in my life where I thought to myself, I would be a better president than this person. And that's far from being some sort of like ego trip thing. It's like, that's actually kind of terrifying to realize. Okay, do I consider myself a socialist? Oh, wow. So socialism is, it has so many, I don't want to say branches, but there's so many different types of socialism. In some sense, I probably do, but I'm not sure in exactly what sense. But I also feel like that it's kind of unwise from a branding point of view. To label yourself a socialist. But I think I would have to actually stop and look, examine different types of socialism and say, I agree with this, I don't agree with that. If you care to try and give me some, like a relatively concise definition of what you're specifically asking about, then I might be able to answer that better. But no, like, I guess it's one of those things where, blue sky thinking. Like in my heart, I'm an anarchist, because I believe that all. I guess so on one hand, human beings, while they don't necessarily need organizations and hierarchies and institutions, that human beings are capable of achieving much more with organizations, institutions, and hierarchies. And so there's simply an advantage to societies that are set up in those ways. A society with a professional military is probably, obviously there's such thing as guerrilla warfare, and we can look at the 21st century, in the 20th century, and even the 21st century of examples of guerrilla warfare. But at a more basic level, oftentimes societies with, say, a professional organized army is in many ways going to defeat, at least in the short term, more tribal societies with just bands of warriors, people, part-time warriors who go to battle when necessary. There are societal. I understand from, I guess, a societal evolutionary point of view why hierarchy and organization and all of these things came about, but and it's hard to, at a pragmatic level, to argue. Like, you can't just wish these things away. And in many ways, trying to remove these things from society, you have to completely reimagine life within society as you know it, and try and game out all the consequences. Like, there are people like Ted Kaczynski, who considered himself an anarcho-primitivist, who wanted humanity to go back to hunter-gatherer level of society. But if you really stop and think about what that would entail, it would entail, in all likelihood, the deaths of billions of people. And then you sort of have to wonder, what really is the point? Like, what is the point of going that far backwards? So yeah, you can't wish away some of these things, but at the same time, I also recognize that in many ways, all institutions and hierarchies, all of these sorts of things, they're subject to dysfunction and corruption and any number of problems that are rather odious. And just even at the level of everyday life, like, you go to your job, right? And you have some middle manager person. Most middle managers that I've encountered in my life, and I think it kind of depends on exactly the nature of the organization itself, and obviously some of them are far better than others, but say working in retail, which is something thankfully I haven't done in a long, long time, but you work at like a big box retailer. You ever wonder why so many of the managers are like abusive bullies? And that they're lazy and incompetent to mediocre at their job. So it's like, how did they get this position of authority? It's like, well, because they're bullies willing to toe the company line, carry water for the company, and that I could go on and on about the ways in which organizations end up dysfunctional. Almost as a function of a lot of different things. Like, to give one random example, I worked at a place, right, and they hired a guy to be kind of one of the more upper mid level management people, and he was kind of like he apparently had something resembling business credentials, but it was sort of like how would I put this? He was like a bro dude, like, yo, I went to business school, bro. And once he became one of the managers, then he started like, you could see like a change in the people who were getting hired to people more like himself. Whereas previously, it was a similar situation where it's like, okay, in hindsight, the company had been hiring this sort of person, and now that this bro dude is, doing more of the hiring, starting to see more of these type of people, the organization, like, you get managers sort of replicating themselves in their own attitudes. There was this idea in the 50s and 60s of like the man in the gray flannel suit, where all the people would try and emulate the CEO and dress similar to the executive of the country, and try and be a part of the same country clubs, and own the same set of golf clubs, in this kind of ass-kissing conformity. I feel like one day I should just like go get a master's or a PhD or something in like, I don't even know what it would be, business organization, just so I could write a book about how organizations become dysfunctional. So bringing it all back around, right? Organizations, human beings accomplish much more and much more complex tasks in most situations working as a group and working in organized, often hierarchical structures than they do as isolated individuals. However, although you can see certain gains and advantages to those organizational structures, they're often dysfunctional in ways that cannot be justified, and often have a trend towards outright injustice. So, like kingship, again, having a clique of a warrior clique might help you defend your society against the neighboring society. But when that warrior clique of people says, well, we can push everyone around within our own society, and now we're lords, and I'm the king, and you're my lords, and you're a baron, and you're an earl, and you're a marquis, and it's all based on your ability to, use violence to get your way internally within your society. That's unjust and radically dysfunctional. And yet, at some point in the evolution of it, it made sense to organize, to begin to organize things in that way. But then people go, we can just use this to fuck over everybody else. Or, you get somebody who's kind of good at organizational things. They start a company, but then they just start self-replicating in who they hire and who they promote. And, the company has to cut costs and get this much productivity out of the workers, but the workers are just humans, so we'll get some bullying dickhead to be the middle manager, and, to hell with turnover. We're paying them crap anyway. We'll just, get the next people to come in. We don't really care about investing in our workers. You see a lot of companies that it's just like, you're just disposable to them. So again, in my heart, I'm an anarchist because I realize how dysfunctional like the organizations of society are. But in my brain, I'm like, nah, you can't just wish these things away. And there are practical reasons behind why they have evolved and why they continue, like how they like societally evolved and how they continue and perpetuate themselves in society. And there are overall advantages to certain kinds of institutions, even if there are also downsides. But I don't really like, again, do I believe in abolishing capitalism? There's an interesting question, because well, it's one of those weird things where capitalism is one of those terms that it was created by critics of what's being described. And most basic definition, private ownership of the means of production. So the question then becomes, who is going to own the means of production? If everything goes down to an individual scale, again, this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of people, there being trade-offs between organizations and, say, a more anarchic system. So a world of cottage industry and individual producers doesn't have advantages like the economy of scale. If we were to strip things back that far back, then we'd have to be imagining a world radically different than our own, and we'd probably have to look to the past to imagine that world, and then everyone would collectively go, why do we want to go backwards like that? On the other hand, another option, of course, would be state control. And I'm not an expert in the Soviet Union or any other similar societies that have had planned state economies, but I know enough to say that there are a lot of downsides to that as well. Because just as I was talking about a moment ago, with all of these things about, terrible bosses who are bullies because they have to crack the whip to keep low-paid workers in line. Well, wait till your asshole bully middle manager can send you to the fucking gulag. The reality is that state control comes with its own problems that in many ways says capitalism, hold my fucking beer. On the other hand, you have things like, a narco-syndicatism, or things where you have co-ops of groups of people. But then you run into questions of all kinds of questions where it's interesting to even begin to game out how that would even work. For example, sometimes it is necessary for companies to make tough decisions like layoffs. I mean, sometimes they just we're going to lay off some people to juice our profits. Other times they're like, we have to get production up. We have to cut costs. We have to do X, Y, and Z. Oftentimes businesses to compete, unless you're just going to abolish markets, which is something separate from capitalism, but often to operate within a market, businesses have to make tough decisions, and I wonder how those tough decisions get made when if the business was run by some sort of co-op where it was like a direct democracy of all employees. How large could you scale up such a business? How would that affect the ability to implement things like economy of scale? Might that regress the economy? How would that work with things like finance? All of these other things. There's no easy, simple, obvious alternatives to capitalism in general. But are there many things that we can do to restructure the sort of corporate capitalism that we have now? Absolutely. Should we? Absolutely. Is our current socioeconomic arrangement not really working for the vast majority of people and therefore failing? Yes. Thoughts on accelerationism? I'm not really super familiar with that. Believe it or not, I actually waste most of my life watching random YouTube crap, and I don't know. Maybe I'm not into that particular vein of intellectualism as some people might assume. I'm more of a book / audiobook sort of person. So I might know about it through that route, but the odds that I'll know some of these more ideas that are more within the I guess you say blogosphere, vlogosphere, whatever, I'm probably generally less attuned to. So, yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I'm more likely to have read a book about, what was it called? I read a book recently about the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe after World War II. I can't remember the name of the book off the top of my head. But accelerationism, I feel like I'm almost certain that I've heard the term, but could I give, I can't even think of a proper definition of what it is, let alone give a coherent opinion on it. But I'm going to take like a 15, 20 second, 30 second break to use the bathroom. All right. I got tonight. We're drinking apple cider because it's Halloween. I should have, when I was up, I should have grabbed my bowl of candy. I probably gained a few pounds in the last couple weeks, the last week and a half or so. Because no, I guess it was last week. I went to the grocery store and I'm like, I want to buy some Halloween candy, but the only bag that I could find with the stuff that I wanted in it was like it was like $12. It was a fairly large bag, so I've been going through this like $12 bag of candy for the last week or so. All right. Okay, accelerationism, like deliberately living in a way that doesn't give back to the system, not supporting it, letting it collapse. I guess this is one of those things where, again, going back to what I was saying about Ted Kaczynski and his idea of anarcho-primitivism, and saying that we would, trying to argue, and I think wrongly, because he really should have consulted an anthropologist about a lot of his ideas. I don't know if you've ever read Ted Kaczynski's manifesto, but just the idea, and putting aside, like, we can think in very abstract terms. Would people be better off in modern, industrialized, hyper-connected society, or going back to being essentially hunter-gatherers and renouncing all of technology? I mean, his idea of how to bring that about is incredibly fanciful and would never happen. But putting aside that, as I said before, there are, what, 7.5 billion people, give or take, on the planet right now. And their survival, by and large, depends on an industrial agricultural system that without it, if you look at the estimates of the human population for most of history, it was, I want to say off the top of my head, for most of human history, hovered around the one, like, sort of peaked and plateaued around the 1 billion mark, and then slowly started going up within the last couple hundred years. Hunter-gatherer, like hunting, and it went up when when human beings switched to agriculture, and then it's like gone way up because of the Industrial Revolution and advancements in agriculture. So you'd have to think that, given what we know about food supplies and the population density within hunter-gatherer societies, that reverting to hunting, hunting and gathering, best case scenario, 6 billion or so people would die. But I think that's even being generous, because imagine if tomorrow, like, everyone suddenly, like, the 7 billion people on this planet all had to live off the land. I think you would devastate the ecosystem. You would probably, there was a game, I want to say it was Ultima Online. It was one of the early MMORPGs, and the creators of the game, they tried to create this very balanced ecosystem. They had rabbits and foxes that hunted the foxes and wolves that hunted the rabbits, and this very balanced ecosystem. And then they introduced the players into the system, and almost immediately they killed everything that lived, like everything that moved, including each other, to the point where they had to create areas where there was no PvP in the game, and then people kind of some people just got stuck in those areas, because the moment you stepped out of the no PvP zones, you just be murdered. That's kind of what I imagine. Like if the population of even the United States or whatever suddenly was thrown back on living off the land, that it would just devastate the ecosystem. So you'd have to come up with an elaborate and increasingly unlikely scenario in which you sort of brought people off of our current system. Like you'd have to wind it down. And I don't think you like what you're saying about accelerationism is as extreme as all of that. But at the same time, I kind of wonder, like, what do you, hold on, I'm using the mixer here, paint mixer. Like, what would be the practical consequences of, you know, a system collapse? And what are you weighing that against? You know, it seems like on one hand, it's like you want the system to collapse to prevent catastrophe, but then the system collapsing itself would, you know, precipitate catastrophe. So it's like, you know, you're between Scylla and Charybdis, basically. I don't know if there really is any other option to try and find a way to sail through both of those options and find something that isn't self-destructive. Because, you know, I'm skimming over a lot here, but in a broad sense, it's like the alternative is, I don't think what, like, okay, the system collapses and then what? Billions starve, like we live, you know, we live in Mad Max world. We live in some post-apocalyptic scenario. Isn't that like, I know that they say, well, the system is going to create that eventually. It's like, well, you can at least play for time and let this, you know, if you play for time, the whole idea is that you're accelerating the collapse of the system. So, in other words, if you didn't accelerate the collapse of the system, that you'd have longer to avoid those questions, you know, like, you know, kick the can down the road. On a personal level, that would seem preferable. On a societal level, it seems like you'd want to stall for time in order to try and find some sort of viable alternative. Because again, it's like, okay, the system collapses, and then what happens? It's like it's not gonna be this magical fairyland where we all become you know, hippie farmers or whatever. I think the consequences themselves would be quite possibly, I don't know. It's like, you know, you want the system to collapse because it's going to lead to a scenario that's just it's like inevitably going to lead to a scenario that you in turn are just like intentionally bringing about. It's like, well, if you want to avoid the scenario of whatever, you know, the system is leading to, then why would you accelerate it, if that makes any sense? But maybe that's not what you're aiming for. I just now realized that I'm like been painting these things, and I realized that I'm not in frame. I'm still kind of getting used to, like I said, the way that I would normally paint something like this. If I were to frame it that way, you'd probably be getting a crotch shot, because I usually hold it closer to myself, you know, like this. Whereas this camera is over the table. And I can do it like this, but there's no real perfect way to set up this camera for this scenario. And these I'm just doing really fast and dirty because they're from the dollar store. Well, Dollar General, but they were $1, so we'll call it a dollar store. I just bought these on impulse. I'm like, I wonder what these would look like actually painted. I'm terribly abusing this brush, as if metallics aren't bad enough for the brush. Ever seen the movie Collapse by Michael C. Rupert? He also did a book called Crossing the Rubicon. No, I have not seen that. I'll have to check that out. Sometimes, though, I just kind of... I don't know. I feel like there's a finite number of perspectives out there. And at a certain point, well, I guess everyone has their own personal spins. I don't want to say like there's, obviously there's a finite number of people out there, so obviously there's going to be a finite number of perspectives, but certain ideas you just hear kind of recycled over and over. And once you get the gist of a certain strain of thought, like a genre of, sort of like a genre of music, you're like, okay, I don't know if I'm in the mood to hear more of this genre of thought. So I have to kind of get a feel of what exactly his angle is. But truth be told, most days I don't really claim any kind of special knowledge of how things will play out or which direction the future will take. And I try and search for... Generally speaking, I try and search for reasons for path, reasons for optimism or paths that might lead forward instead of backwards or down, because it's really easy to find reasons to say, it's all gonna turn out shit. Like it's like, what's the line from The Dark Knight where Joker says, madness is like gravity, you just need a little push, or however the line goes. It's like, that's kind of how I feel about pessimism. It's like pessimism's like gravity. I'm not, at a certain point, it's too easy. It's too easy to just be like, well, everything's fucked, everything's terrible, it's all gonna turn out shit. It's like, well, that's kind of lazy and unsatisfying. That's like, on one hand, you have to have a realistic appraisal of how things are and how things work and that sort of thing, but so it's sort of like a battle where it's like I don't want to be pessimistic, so I search for points of optimism, but I don't fully commit myself to those points of optimism because I'm not, it's just that. It's just optimistic thinking has its own, it loses, it's hard for it's like pushing a boulder uphill. It's just like the mental gravity of pessimism and optimism. Keep trying to remember what part of this is in frame. All right. This may go down as one of the sloppiest paint jobs I've ever done. But I still think that I'm not done with these yet, but I think that I'm going to focus on it, like trying out some stuff on a couple of them rather than going through and doing stuff for each one. So definitely this Mall Angel, I want to focus on that one. And maybe this one. Focus on 2 for right now. Worth a watch, basically about energy versus energy out in peak oil. Energy in versus energy out. How old? Now that you say that, I'm wondering how old that documentary is, because it might have been something that I watched like 15 years ago. If I didn't watch it like 10 or 15 years ago, then I haven't watched it, because I feel like I've watched something in that vein, talking about peak oil and all of that sort of stuff. And I guess that's one of those areas where I guess I don't want to say I'm optimistic, but there are certain things like about human beings. I don't want to say the invisible hand of the market or some capitalist Adam Smith bullshit like that. But I think at a certain point, like, human beings do like try and confront problems. There are certain problems that human beings are collectively terrible at confronting, individually and collectively terrible at confronting, and there are other ones where it's there are enough reasonably intelligent people with resources behind them who can recognize a problem and start to try and tackle that problem. And I think things like energy, although politically speaking, it's hard not to just despair. But at the same time, it's like one way or the other, we're going to have to completely reinvent our energy infrastructure. And basically, you have politically, it's like you have one party that, although they're often rather tepid, at least has some notion of the bigger picture and wants to do something. And then another party who is hyper-fixated on the negative side of the trade-offs equation. So, for example, if you go off oil, there's going to be people who work in that industry. They're going to, potentially lose their jobs, just like, horse and buggy makers lost their jobs, and so many other industries have gone through the process of creative destruction of capitalism. But God forbid that their constituents in Louisiana or whatever have to suffer through the effects of capitalism. And so not only does the Republican Party seem only fixated on the potential downsides of it and the loss side of the trade-off equation, but it also happens that the overwhelming majority of the campaign contributions and lobbying money from the fossil fuel industry just so happens by complete coincidence to go into the coffers of Republican campaigns. So by complete coincidence, they just happen to have come up with the entirely intellectual position about denying things like climate change and not wanting to go through the massive undertaking of reinventing our energy infrastructure, which is in many ways necessary one way or the other. I'd recommend a book called The Grid. There's probably some subtitle to it that I'm forgetting, but it's called The Grid, about the energy system. That was very interesting, because it's not just like, hey, here's how great renewables are going to be. It talks about the entire energy system as a whole, its strengths, its weaknesses, how it works. I think the complexity of it. It's the areas where it's aging, the things that where renewable energy falls short, and how to complement for that. or augment for that. It's been a few years since I read it, but it's definitely an interesting book to learn more about the energy infrastructure. Oh yeah, Michael was an ex-cop exposed on live TV about being approached by the FBI or CIA, being involved in drugs, and and asking to turn a blind eye, and he didn't. Let's see, what could I do to this to make it look interesting? Let's see. Nargle Rot. Blood for the Blood God. Maybe put some oxidization on the axe. And typhus corrosion. It's like time to break out the technical paints. Some wild wood for this. Yeah, it almost seems like a waste. It's like, aside from just slathering on some technical paints, it almost seems like a waste to try and do any real detail work on this thing. I sound exactly tabletop standard. And it's funny because even though I only paid $1 for this, if I printed something with, like, I have a resin printer, and if I found something sort of like this and printed, a batch of these with my resin printer, it would probably also cost around $1 and be better in every conceivable way. I love having a resin printer, but if you play tabletop games like Warhammer and you get a resin printer and you go to the shop and you're like, hey, I got a resin printer. You're going to get the other players go, oh, could you maybe print me blah, blah? And you want to be friendly, right? You want to, these are the people in your local game store, and, so you're like, yeah, I'll print you out some stuff. And I would just say, if you ever find yourself in that position, I would definitely recommend caution, because they're going to be like, oh, I want 10 of these, and 12 of these, and 10 of those. And I'm only slightly exaggerating, because that's the thing about a game like Warhammer. I agreed to print some stuff for someone, and he was literally like, oh, can I get 10 of these? Or no. Damn it. The hell did that go? I just dropped my brush. Anyway, he wanted some, like, knockoff Chaos Marines, basically. And I think I printed out like 20 or 30 of these things. And it and another person who wanted something else, and then ended up printing off like a ton of these, and they all had lots of tiny little parts, and I still am in the process of trying to assemble all that crap. And it's just because of the nature of war games, like they don't just want one figure or a couple figures. It's like they're like, oh, I want this, and I want like a squad of them, and a squad is like 10 fucking things for most of it. But Hang on a second. I'll find this brush that I just dropped. Jesus H. Christ, that was needlessly difficult. It fell into the. I have a one of those stands. Not well. There's like one of those rolling art supply container things for my airbrush. I keep the airbrush and compressor and airbrush supplies in, and it like fell into there. Have I seen the Astartes fan film? Yeah. Although I think they might have expanded on it recently, and I haven't seen that. I did get Warhammer Plus, not because I love the idea of Warhammer Plus, just because I already had the app, and it was like, oh, it was only slightly more to get this. I don't know. Some people use what's the other app? But I found that like the other army building app, good in some ways, but also kind of clunky. Although the Warhammer app is kind of clunky too. I guess I am in a lot of ways one of those people that companies like that love, where I'll just subscribe to crap and then just be like, yeah, whatever. Not worry about whether I'm getting adequate value off it. Not too many things, but I just realized the other day that I really need to go in and get rid of my DC. It's like DC something subscription, because when I first got it, it had a lot more stuff, and then they ended up moving a lot of the content, like the video content, to HBO Max, which I also have. And then I realized, like, I'm never actually watching, or I'm never actually using the apps for the features that it have, like reading comic back issues and crap like that. Like, I never actually do that for the most part, and I'm not getting any actual value out of this app. And even though it was, I don't know, like $5 or $6 a month, it just wasn't really using it enough to justify it. But I was also kind of not paying enough attention to unsubscribe. Like every time I see the email notification for the bill, I'm like, I need to get rid of that, and then just get distracted and not do it. I'm like exactly the sort of customer that those companies hope for. They lure you in thinking you're gonna get more out of it than you do, and then you just keep procrastinating about getting rid of it. This probably, hang on. Yeah, well, what I heard about, okay, so the person who made the Astartes and he got hired by GW, I guess there was a lot of controversy behind that because, you know, they started putting out their Warhammer Plus service, and so they started either buying off some of the people who were making the fan films while simultaneously going on an aggressive, a rather aggressive, like copyright threat campaign to try and get certain things removed. And that created a lot of ill will. It was this very, like, very poorly considered. I don't know if this Nurgle rot is really has something dripping out of the eyes. Yeah, I'm not going to use too much of this crap. I'm basically going to use this one as a test to see what works and what doesn't. Okay, blood for the blood god. Yeah, the thing you probably the thing that you're hearing is called a vortex mixer. It's for mixing paints. Well, I mean, it mixes a lot of different things, but it's one of those things that cost more than could probably be justified. But I use it all the time. Like every time I paint, every pot of paint that I use. So I personally think that it wasn't too bad of an investment. I'm kind of bad at creating realistic looking like blood patterns on stuff. I guess it's time to Google what the blood patterns actually are when you butcher something. And then I'll get a nice visit from the authorities. Or go on some sort of NSA watch list, most likely. I think that doesn't look too bad. Maybe put some in his mouth. Maybe be a vampire skeleton zombie. Because this... make it says like dripping down from his mouth. Yeah, because the green Nurgle's rot is really more, Plague Marine zombie type stuff. And the skeleton, like, he doesn't have any flesh left on his bones. But, yeah, that's the thing about skeletons. Is like, there's not a lot of detail to work with in terms of, like, okay, I painted... I could do, like, what's it called? Highlights, but then it almost becomes like, what will be the point? Did I knock? I didn't even realize that I had knocked the... When the hell did that happen? Probably when I was looking for the paintbrush. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about this. Because it started out kind of tan to begin with. And I don't know if I've really done anything that gets it. I haven't based it, either done any basing yet, but I don't know if I've really done or could do anything that's really going to get this beyond the fact that it's like, $8 for $1 plastic miniature. Hang on a second. Shit. I don't want to get a picture-in-picture thing. There. That'll work better. I can still... I figured I'd take a break from painting for a second. So I have to kind of hunch over. The setup's kind of a mess. And now, no, shit. I think I might have to switch back to this mode anyway. I kind of realized that I have to do weird thing. This is a really weird setup. It's not ideal. I'm thinking, what else can I do to these things? I still want to take a break from painting, but I mostly realized that when I moved back that I was too far away from the microphone, but I still got to look over to the side, and the camera's over here. I need I need one of those Steam Decks and put the Steam Deck right here, and then have multiple cameras so I can look at this. Then I put another monitor right in front of me, but I don't have the I'm a millionaire Twitch streamer money yet, so. And I don't base my setup of things based on doing streaming. I just have to improvise. The lighting kind of sucks. You're talking about companies licensing, 40K and other Games Workshop stuff. I mean, there's been a lot. There's a lot of Warhammer-based video games. I honestly, I think really the only one that I've played at all was the first Dawn of War. I recently bought some of the Dawn of I bought some Dawn of War. I think maybe the third. I don't remember if I bought the whole trilogy. But it's kind of like in my never-ending and mostly unused collection of Steam games. But my understanding is that there have been a lot of video games, and some of them are of great quality. They range a lot in quality. So it's hard to say. Of course, people whenever something like 40K gets popular or any other kind of game, they always think like a movie. Although I think that might be not as big of a thing as it was, say, 30 years ago, for people to think about. Oh, they gotta make this into a movie. But I feel like I've talked about this in streams in the past. But with certain types of franchises that are based specifically things that based on like games or video, like massively online multiplayer games. When you sit down and watch videos about the lore, right, and you sort of delve into the lore, it's a bit of a mess. It can be interesting, but it's also a bit of a mess. And I don't think there's any easy, accessible way to streamline some of that stuff into things like movies very easily. And that's why I wonder, like, they're doing they're doing yet another Dungeons and Dragons movie. This time, they actually seems like it has a budget and some stars behind it. But it's one of those things where it's a game. There's a lot of ideas in it, but there's no like the whole point of the game is to make up your own, to come up with your own story. Based on the interaction of the players of the game and the dungeon master and everything else going on. And so all they can do is come up with a story, possibly a quite cliche story, that they just throw in all of these other references and settings and seemingly unrelated things too. Or they have to focus on some particular thing out of the spin-off novelizations. And there's a tendency for games, the lore of games, to become a bloated mess, to become a sort of idea salad, and to be full of cliches and sometimes half-baked ideas. And then when they try and sanitize that for a more mainstream thing, then it just, it starts to lose its charm. But then you can just see, you can just see where it's oh, they're just putting a D&D filter over this typical Hollywood shit, or a 40K filter over this typical Hollywood shit.
But there always people that see dollar signs and that sort of thing and think, oh, we could make a lot of money adapting this. You think they all blow? The cutscenes look good? You mean all the Warhammer video games? I remember, like, it's been a long. Like I said, I recently repurchased Dawn of War off Steam, and I think I might have gotten the third game too. Although the weird thing about the Dawn of War franchise is apparently they all play very differently, like completely differently, which has been pretty controversial. But I've always been, I've been a fan for at least 20 years plus now of RTS games. So I've been wanting to go back and replay Dawn of War and see and maybe explore some of the other games. But yeah, it seems like one of those properties that there's a lot they can theoretically do with it, but they're just like, hey, let's take a first-person shooter and throw the Warhammer filter on it. Let's take and that's sort of what I was saying about Hollywood too. It's like, there's this prepackaged idea, a first-person shooter or a third-person shooter, and you kind of know if you play those genres, you know what to expect. Just like you know what to expect from like an action adventure movie and that sort of thing. And then it's just like, let's just put this in the Warhammer setting. And it rarely, I think it's just inherently hard for those things to rise above mediocrity. Because it's often trying to balance things, like the hodgepodge of lore and influences and all the other things that were going on with that to begin with. So it's like they kind of work in one context. Like it works as a tabletop game. You could probably make a halfway decent video game out of certain ideas. It can transfer well into some things and not into others. I wonder how many times Hollywood has tried to make some version of a Monopoly movie. That's what I wonder. Because that's been like in development hell in Hollywood since like the 30s or something. Okay, so in terms of, a franchise becomes known and it becomes like they make the movie for a mainstream audience. I think that's part of it, but what I'm trying to say is that it would be almost impossible to make it for actual fans because it's often a different medium. If you're a fan of Warhammer, how do you or Dungeons and Dragons? Like I said, they're apparently, I think Chris Pine is supposed to star in the movie, and it's like in production now. And there have been other notorious previous Dungeons and Dragons movies. How would you make it for fans in a way that wouldn't be utterly like baffling to the point where it would be guaranteed to bomb? I mean, I think there are reasons for making it for non-fans, but it's different when you're adapting a book, something that already has that like is written in a way that it has dramatic structure, and maybe you need to trim the book down, eliminate parts of it, make certain parts of the story more accessible and less opaque. I mean, there's adapting a book, but when you adapt a game, it's like it's already is not it doesn't already have that built-in elements of dramatic structure as a skeleton. Like a well-written book is going, a novel is going to have something, generally speaking, is going to have something akin to dramatic structure where it's going to be easy to do something like base a movie off of it. Whereas when you take Warhammer or Warcraft or Dungeons and Dragons, these games, they're games. They don't really have dramatic structure. They have a setting, they have a world, they might have characters, they might have very often a whole slew of novels based on the thing. Oftentimes, they would avoid those things because they have writers, I want to say like journeyman writers and other people who sort of have created those specific novels, and they generally would want to avoid having to deal with the rights and the payments and licensing with those specific authors. So they end up just kind of cherry picking recognizable things, and let's do this, that, and the other thing. Then let's take a general action adventure story or whatever, and just like drop it within that setting. So it's just, it makes sense why that would happen, and it would make sense why they would do it for non-fans. But I just think that games themselves are at a disadvantage when it comes to being adapted to certain things, and that oftentimes these sprawling games like 40K or Dungeons and Dragons or Warhammer, they have all these settings and have all this lore, but it's in a way that's just like, word salad. It's like they just throw whatever idea sticks, whatever idea suits their fancy, and then when you try and actually explain it coherently to a person, then it's kind of like, what? And if you want to do these big, a big movie with a high budget, which you'd almost have to do for science fiction or fantasy, then you have to pitch it to a large audience. I've been on here for 2 hours and 15 minutes already. All right. Last I checked, I had 2 viewers. Who knows if anyone will actually watch this stream after the fact. But kudos to you if you are watching this stream days or weeks later, going, what was he rambling about this time? Hopefully I'll be back in the near future, either with, number one, a stream where I'm not distracted by painting and I'm just dedicated talking to people, and at which time I'd almost choose a time and a day that is not a holiday where people are out getting drunk and partying and having fun. So there might be more than 2 to 4 people watching at any given time. And hopefully I'll be back with actual structured, pre-planned, edited video content where I'm not just rambling. But I think I'm going to end this stream here in a minute and find a horror movie to watch and eat some more of the big bag of candy that I bought. So have a good night to whoever's watching, and I will see you later.